So yes, my name is Ahmed. I'm the programs manager here at the Asian American Writers Workshop. For over 30 years, the workshop has focused on amplifying the work of Asian American writers. It does so from what we like to call a radically inclusive ethos. That may sound very highfalutin and not very well defined, but what we take that to mean is expanding what it means not only to be Asian American, but also what it means to be a writer. And so we like to platform writers who do that sort of work, like Zara. I like to keep things short. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up both Zara and Nur to speak. I'll read their bios first so that we understand how amazing they are, and you can cheer them on with gusto. Nur Nasreen Ibrahim is a journalist, television producer, and writer from Lahore, Pakistan. Her speculative fiction, literary fiction, and personal essays have been published by the AAWW, Salmagundi, and Barrel House, and anthologized in collections from Harper Perennial, Catapult, and Platypus Press. She is a senior editor with the South Asian Avant-Garde Anthology and a two-time finalist for the Salam Award for Imaginative Fiction. Zara Chowdhary is a writer and lecturer at the University of Wisconsin. She has an MFA in creative writing and environment from Iowa State University and a master's in writing for performance from the University of Leeds. She has previously written for documentary, television, advertising, and film. She lives in Madison, Wisconsin with her partner, child, and two cats. Please put your hands together for Nur and Zara.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
And me?
Yeah.
I'm not gonna need this actually, you know, I have a what we call buland awaz. Yeah. Maybe you don't, yeah, actually I'll need it probably. But thank you everyone for being here. I'll just do a quick introduction to this beautiful memoir and then we will listen to Zara read a section from it. So the Lucky Ones is Zara's first memoir. It's set around the events of 2002 in Gujarat, where Zara is 16 years old and living with her family in Ahmedabad, one of India's fastest growing cities, when a gruesome train fire claims the lives of 60 Hindu right-wing volunteers and upends the life of 5 million Muslims. Instead of taking her school exams that week, Zara is put under a 3-month siege, with her family and thousands of others fearing for their lives as Hindu neighbors, friends, and members of civil society transform overnight into bloodthirsty mobs, hunting and massacring their fellow citizens. The chief minister of the state at the time, Narendra Modi, will later be accused of fomenting the massacre, and yet a decade later will rise to become India's prime minister, sending the world's largest democracy hurtling towards cacophonous Hindu nationalism. So thank you so much, Zara, for being here with us and for gracing us with your presence and these wonderful words, the lucky ones. So let's take it away. Thank you everybody so much for being here. I'm going to read from somewhere in the start of the book and then talk a little bit. This is Fire and Faith. In Hinduism, fire is a means by which physical life transforms into something more eternal, ethereal, rid of its material prison, the body. Mukti, they call it, freedom. In Islam, to have been touched by fire is to know Allah's wrath. Azab, they call it, hellfire. The first time I played with fire, lit a matchstick I didn't quite know how to hold, I was 10. I set a Sufi saint's photo of flame on the dresser in Dadi's room. She had ordered me to place 2 smoking incense sticks in the marble holder in front of this picture as part of her daily ritual to cleanse her apartment of evil energies. Seeing no one around and the matchbox unattended, I couldn't help myself. The next morning, there was just a small powdery gray mound of ash where the saint had stood. It was an accident, I swore to myself, but I didn't dare own up. I couldn't risk it. Our home believed in many things, but not in its daughters. When Misbah was 3, she was touched by fire like the azab it can be. Both her thighs were thoroughly scorched by a misdirected Diwali rocket that instead of soaring toward the stars, plummeted down to where she was sitting in our cousin's veranda. It struck right between her knees, exploding, setting the child alight. Her lady parts were fortunately spared, but she developed a lifelong fear of any kind of flame afterward. Seeing her burnt flesh hanging loose in chunks like that, the shock in her big dark eyes, I felt confused about Allah for the first time. If Allah listened to young children first, how could they let this happen? Her screams had been loud enough for the whole neighborhood to come rushing. Papa said sometimes he still heard them in his dreams. When Diwali rolled around each year and our neighborhood erupted in a cacophony of fireworks, little Misbah would crawl under our parents' bed, her chubby hands punching her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. She would remain there, curled in the dark underbelly of the bed, waiting for Diwali, the night of her nightmares, to end. We watched the state-run Gujarati news together. 2 train compartments of the Sabarmati Express set alight with 60-odd persons on board, at least 10 children in the official figure. The news anchor, a woman with a beautiful aquiline nose, wearing bright red lipstick, struggles to remain poker-faced as she reads through the grisly details. Doors locked, kerosene poured, coaches set on fire, people trapped inside screaming. I can feel my whole family, all 6 of us, holding our breath. It is unusual for news to be this graphic and unfiltered, as if the news channel has gone straight from the shocked mouths of the field reporters to live telecast, unedited. This is a new feeling for us. The only other time we saw something like this on Indian television was when the Twin Towers came crashing down in America, and we watched it live from our little corner in real time, jaws dropping in sync with jaws in the streets of New York City. Firefighters rush about on screen, dousing the last flames, while the chief minister and his team survey the charred interiors of the maroon coaches. This man, our chief minister, Narendra Modi, is a man none of us have heard much from before, nor do we care. In Gujarat, which party governs doesn't really matter when it comes to Muslims. The news anchor repeatedly and emphatically points out that these passengers were Ghar Sevaks, religious workers, traveling back from Ayodhya, a sacred city for Hindus, on a holy cause. They were helping campaign for building a temple to Lord Ram over the debris of a 500-year-old mosque they had demolished a decade ago. I'm too naive then to understand why these words are being repeated. Cruelty is wrong. It's as simple as that, the way Amma explains it. No one deserves to die in this terrible, grisly way. What did the person who pulled the chain and stopped the train, or the hand that poured the kerosene, how did they not see the children? Do they not know how much it hurts to burn? The newscaster continues. The chief minister, while visiting the town of Godhra, declared this the worst terrorist attack on the state. Something about his words sends another chill around the room. When the Twin Towers were attacked, America kicked off a global war against terror. We've seen their planes on our TV screens, bombing mountains, flattening homes and hospitals. The Americans have redefined how a strong, powerful nation deals with those who try to terrorize it. And in Gujarat, the average Gujarati is very much in awe of America. We want their malls, we want their clothes, we want their McDonald's and Pizza Huts and suitcases stuffed with everything a Walmart shopping cart can fit. Americans make war and decimating an enemy with food. Now here he is on our screens, our guy Modi, basically calling the burning a pre-planned act of terror. It just happened. There has been no investigation, and tomorrow the bodies of the dead are to be driven in a parade across the state, in a decision sanctioned by the government. The dead will be brought to our big city hospital in Ahmedabad before being handed over to their kin. We're going under what in India is called a ban, a people's curfew. Shops, businesses, schools, and offices must remain closed by the order of not the government, but the party of the chief minister, the BJP. Usually, this means anyone who dares to defy it will face the wrath of its volunteers and grassroots members who call themselves funky names and acronyms like the Bajrang Dal or the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, which is the World Hindu Council. Papa turns to wash our faces for the first time all evening. He has a weird habit of smirking when things are about to go wrong, as if he knew they would. Or perhaps he's steeling himself with mirth. Our city, Ahmedabad, has a long history of religious violence, dating back way before 9/11. It doesn't matter if the clash is over worker rights, caste rights, or property. Issues have a way of alchemizing into a Hindu-Muslim fight here. Our peace is tentative. Our trust is fractured. Bikes are routinely set on fire here, TV sets smashed at the slightest provocation, like when India loses a cricket match to Pakistan. But this is no cricket match, and Papa's smirk looks tremulous at best. The city outside our balcony has quieted. Frenzied groceries bought, shops shuttered, building gates locked down, birds frozen in the giant neem and banyan trees that stand sentinel along our streets, holding their breath in their wings. I walk away from the family and out onto the balcony. Pre-planned act of terror. My chief minister's words ring in my ears. 1,000 invisible fingers from every direction are pointing toward our balcony. 1,000,000 eyes turning to where the Muslims sit, huddled in their homes all over the state. It doesn't matter this evening that this land we all stand on is the land of Gandhi. Something has been eviscerated. Something has changed. A new land and a new people reborn in fire.
Yeah, thank you so much for, do you want to read another section? Maybe later. Okay, thank you so much for that. It's really powerful section. I have a lot of questions about the political scene and everything that's going on, but I want to start with a more craft-based question. There's a lot of there's so much layering going on throughout this memoir. You have the thread of communal violence. You have this ongoing thread of inter-family dynamics and inter-family battles that are constantly being fought. You have essentially this history of India also running through, a cultural history of all these arts and even fabrics that are being discussed, like the one we see on the cover of the book. And I really wanted to know, while there's so many narratives being threaded through this, where did you really start when you began writing this memoir, and what was your jumping off point?
Thank you so much, Noor, and thank you all for coming this evening. This room is just full of faces of people I love, have known since I was a child, and also faces of people who have embraced me as their child in some ways in this world. So thank you. This story actually, I mean, it's something that I've carried with me for so many years, and it was always threatening and bubbling in all of the other writing work, all of which was always commissioned and for a purpose. And so you'd see a mother lost in a riot somewhere, you'd see a daughter who's not able to find her way home. There would be these little smatterings of character, but I wasn't allowing myself to write this, especially while I lived in India till 2014. There was no question of really writing this. But when I came to the US and I went off on this residency, and God bless people who make residencies for people like me, I actually found my entryway through a poem. I took this poetry workshop and I found it incredibly generative. And this one evening, I had to just come up with something that felt more like autobiographical in some ways. And as I started to write, it became this piece that was about my father and about the fact that he goes to work and he faces all of this discrimination as a Muslim public servant in the Gujarat electricity board, and how he comes back and starts to drink, and then our house catches fire. And the strange thing to me when I finished writing it was that it wasn't in the voice of 30-something Zara, it was in the voice of like an 8 or 10-year-old. And even the title had that sort of naivete to it of, to the men who trouble my papa at work. It's what it said. And even as I looked at what I had just written, I started to recognize that I was getting increasingly angry as I was thinking about his anger. And that by the end of it, the sort of violence that was within the household was a violence and rage I was feeling in myself. And I think in the original draft that I wrote, I called these men I'm directly referring all of these cuss words by the end of it. And that really showed me suddenly this sort of trickle of slow violence. And I started to recognize that what I have carried in me is not just about those 3 months of 2002, but it's really 20 years of my father's service in government, 40 years before of my grandfather, who's been a public servant. And so this sense of rage as an Indian Muslim of recognizing that not only do they literally burn your home when you become the bogeyman, but they have slowly been burning your life from the inside too.
That actually is something I was thinking about a lot. You have all this interior pain and family violence threaded through the novel, your relationship with your father, your father's relationship with your mother. There's all these tense moments throughout, the memoir. There's all these tense moments where you're both anxious about what's going to happen within the household, and you're anxious about what's going to happen outside the household, because there's violence outside, there's mobs outside, and there's this dual layer of violence is what sort of builds the reader's anxiety. And I'm sure if, of course, you were in it, your anxiety, it must have created that extra tension. And I'm just wondering, as you were writing this and trying to sort of thread both these elements together, how did you find sort of the balance that worked for you and for this memoir? Like, how did you know when to sort of bring in the right tone for whether it was for your family, and then the tone for what is this larger religious violence happening around you?
I mean, my education in literature really has come from film. And if you think of how even Indian cinema is structured, it is the Navrasas, right? We do this automatically. It's a very instinctive way in which we create art. And so for me, a lot of times it would be like a song montage that I was thinking of in my head, to be very honest about it. But also, I think when you lived with all of these layers of trauma, a thing that I slowly started to realize is the more you only go back to remembering the worst that happened, that becomes more defined. And so it becomes an art and almost a practice in remembering the good, but remembering those tiny moments of wonder, that small sense of joy, that little brief window of relief. And so to start to sort of sensorially think and pick through some of those experiences, for me, I had to really go back to the idea of Uttaran and kite flying in Gujarat, right? Which has always been this incredible moment of just outpouring of emotion and catharsis for a whole state.
Yeah.
And so we also have that. We've had these moments, or what dance means to my sister and me, and how much, whether it was us locking ourselves in the bedroom and playing these tapes, and our mom peeking in and watching us, and our cousin sitting there and watching us, or my dadi watching like Wahida Rahman on TV, and like, her one bad foot she would tap and then tell me, okay, you dance and show me. It's those tiny moments that you have to hold on to so that you start to see what are the things that fed you. How are you here, right? Because sometimes it's funny when you start to tell your own story, and if it's a story where you're only regurgitating trauma, you'll start to ask yourself, why am I living? Why am I here? And I had to really remind myself what got me here. And it was that sort of remembrance.
Yeah, there's a lot of wonderful moments where yes, the moment where you and your sister are dancing, and then there's you pair the story of Ayodhya that we see in this section with the other Ayodhya, which is you and your family friends, a multi-religious community with multiple languages going on vacation together. And it's this lovely, very light passage where you feel at ease and you're comforted by this idea of like, this is a kind of India that you dream of having, and you wish that it sustains itself, and so with pairing those two Ayodhyas together, one chapter after the other, I'm wondering like what's the sort of hope that you have for people who are reading moments like that, especially your book just came out in India, as we were just discussing yesterday, and you're probably going to get responses from people in India now
Yes.
over the next few weeks.
Right.
So what hope do you have by sharing these kinds of anecdotes side by side?
I mean, I feel like juxtaposition is such a strong tool in our toolbox, right? And when I put the story of Ayodhya, the city, and the Babri Masjid history on the page, I am living out a history that is not my lived history. It's the thing that the news have told me, and I've heard from generations. And it's this sort of inherited rage that I'm supposed to feel. And frankly, to me, that mosque has not meant anything. But the fact of what it means legally and the sort of injustice that its demolition means for our larger democracy, those are the things that should anger me, like they should anger any citizen. But this sense of, because you're Muslim, you should feel some sort of extra rage was a learned behavior. But the Ayodhya that I do know in my bones is this house where we went every summer, and it was my father's old friends from college there was a huge wealth gap. There was a huge class disparity between us. My father would buy our train tickets on the LTS, the thing that the government gives you, where they give you a few free tickets for your family every summer. And he would save that only to go see these friends each year, because we'd have a free place to stay and we wouldn't have to pay for a hotel, and they would take us around. And so he couldn't afford a holiday. And that window of those summers in the South, just sort of driving through the Nilgiris and stopping to see bison and just seeing trees, because we lived in this urban sort of building and a dry riverbed in front of us. We didn't even have a natural world that as children we had, grown up in. And to have that breath every summer meant so much. But even again, as I was writing that piece, there's a line that came to me towards the end of it, which said, everybody looked out for each other and everybody protected the children. And that I recognized was why I loved those summers so much. It was when my father was at his least aggressive. He was as drunk, but he was not as angry, because he was amongst friends. He was amongst people that saw him as a full human being. And so for that little brief moment, I had a father even in the summer. But the fact that there were all these other people who recognized what was broken in our family and who saw in my sister and me something worth protecting. Also, when you zoom out and you think of India, that becomes the ask, and that becomes the hope, that we start to see all children as our children, and we start to see something worth protecting.
That's a very powerful moment in that section where your father says something angrily and the friends suddenly jump in and they sort of surround your mother and they surround you. And that sort of leads me to another sort of process question. It's obviously there's a lot of pain that you're excavating writing this, both familial pain and this experience of being Indian Muslim and facing micro and macro aggressions in school and in workplace and all these spaces. And so as you were, as a reader, I was feeling that tension and that fear build up through various scenes in the apartment, the claustrophobia. It was just so visceral for me as a reader. And I was just wondering how when you relived all this on paper, how were you coping mentally? How were you dealing with sort of bringing all this stuff out?
Yeah, strangely, going back to Jasmine, even in memory, was a comfort. As hard as it was, as much as it broke me down in several moments of remembering how just tough it was for Amma, for Misbah, for myself, it did something for the child that I just sort of brought out of Gujarat with me, and that has now traveled the world in these ways, right? I've carried that other Zara with me. And so I think going back almost felt, at least in memory, like this sort of pilgrimage, like this sort of looking at a place and recognizing that it did what it could do for you in that moment. And that's the best it could. And you take the good of it and you leave the harm there, and then you walk away. So it was that one sort of final looking back at a place that made you, for good or bad.
It's a really beautiful way to describe it. Now I want to sort of broaden and talk about a lot more about sort of the politics of the world around this. You talk in the book, you bring up a lot of Holocaust history and Jewish history of how the ghettos were built in the 16th century. Italy with the Jewish community, you bring in a lot of comparisons to other communities that have essentially been ghettoized and ostracized. And you also talk about it as genocide of Muslims, Indian Muslims in the country. And these days, as we know, like to call something a genocide is resulting in a lot of controversy. We're seeing it with Gaza. We see sort of this, to put it mildly, we see it, people criticizing language and how we name certain things. So why was it so important as you were writing it? How did it become so important to name what was happening in 2002 pogrom, call it a genocide, and have you since then faced some kind of sort of pushback and say, you know, this was decades ago, but today in India, I imagine that you would still face that kind of criticism for calling something as it is, or, you know, being blunt about certain things. Because it seems like there's just been more censorship and more repression since then, so.
Right. I mean, there's the first big sort of political task, right, of wresting language back from the judiciary. We've given so much of the best of our language to these legal systems, and these legal systems then have evolved into creatures of their own, which then mold themselves to whoever's in power. And especially in India, we've seen that sort of warping of the judiciary in a way where, to somebody observing from the outside, everything seems like it's working despite all of these challenges. And yet for those who are at the receiving end of this, justice has not been, you know, delivered in the way that it needs to. So whatever the courts might want to call it and whatever the scholars might want to call it, I think for me, the question always became of intention. And I like to think of this word in Urdu more because the idea of niyat is very close to how I live in every aspect. And this idea that if you go in with a certain intention, then it's that intention that supersedes how you possibly changed in your action later.
Very religious.
It is, it's faith, and it comes from the spiritual practice, where even if you don't read your namaz, but you made the niyat to remember your God, then that has taken you one step closer, right? And I think the flip side of that also exists, where if your intention has been sort of wretched towards this community, then genocide is about intention. And that is even the legal definition. It is not about the numbers. It is not about the scale. It is about what was the intent within the mobs, within the state, what was all of this apparatus doing at the time when these folks were running around trying to burn people alive, right? And that intention for those of us who were within those communities was very clear. The fact that you have a city divided by a river, one whole side is ghettoized, and that side cannot live normally for 3 months. Those children must fear for their lives to just go give their board exams. And somebody from the other side, a school friend, is able to call you and say, hey, you want to go to McDonald's tomorrow? And how
They have no idea.
They have no idea that you live under curfew, and this is how much your life has closed off and there is no hope. And that disparity in that moment, you're not sitting across a river, you're sitting in two worlds. And that sort of, then, you know, to me, it feels like we had already created this sort of apartheid city for ourselves.
That sort of brings me to this, again, one of my I have many favorite sections, but this was one about naming and how names create divisions. They also are a form of power and how they define your caste, your religion, your, I guess your profession, even your, and whether you're named with affection or you're named with something which is a disability, like Danga or whatever, right? There's a man who commits violence in this, who's from a lower caste, who's disabled as well, and he is sort of a source of a lot of violence. But he's also turned into this grotesque figure through that nickname that his society has given him, right? And so, could you talk a little bit about the role that, you know, names have played, and like how you sort of, I guess, talk a little bit about the names that you pulled through this memoir, how you grew from them and selected the names that would have the most impact in telling the story.
Wow, I love that question so much. So, I mean, my love for names and this idea of where they come from and why we do these things is another extension of love for language. But there's also all this storytelling, right? This mythology that is built within families of mothers telling daughters why they name them something, and you know, who's having the right to name them and not anybody else. And there's all this power within families of who gets to name whom and what sort of name that is. Mine, for instance, for the longest time, I was like, wow, there must be some great magical story to it. And then it turned out that my mother was watching this Pakistani drama for 2 years on these tapes that somebody used to smuggle across into Gujarat. And that it was Tanhaiya, and there was a Zara in it.
Everyone loves that.
And she was the most soppy, sad person ever. When I watched it, I was like, she has a miserable life. Why did you name me after her? And my mother's like, no, you know, I want you to grow up to have that sort of strength and courage. But really, the one thing that stuck with me was she would keep saying, I wished for you a sister. I watched this and I wished for you a sister. And the sense that, again, you know, there's something self-prophecy like about how we name our children and what we think their lives will end up being. But within thinking about who this book was about and how to represent people, there were so many pieces to it, right? There's the chapter where I really talk about names as actual currency and who gets to be safe in a society based on how you're named. And the fact that there's so many instances of luck in this story. And this idea, for those who don't understand that it's a very ironic title. There's people who come and say, we want to take a picture with you and then we'll be the lucky ones. And I'm like, but
the moment they call your name out.
Yes,
at the school
that's
exams,
right,
it's a
right?
very stressful moment where you turn out to be lucky because no one
knows how to, and also no one knows how to pin down Zara.
Exactly.
It could be Parsi, it could be Muslim, it could just
And
be
Chowdhary
fun and
as well,
cool Hindu name, right?
And Chowdhary is just a Punjabi.
Right, and it's just a title, and it could be again, and we would get this all the time. Oh, are you Bengali? Wait, are you Punjabi? And they just couldn't tie these things together. And it was only my father's name that actually gave away my religion. So when I would write Zara Zahir Chowdhary, then they would immediately know where I was coming from. And so those sort of questions, especially given things like hall ticket and government papers and documents and how much that stuff starts to risk your life in a moment like this, became very clear as I was writing that section. But also, I'd like to talk about the people that I chose to make part of this story, even tangentially. And that was Ehsan Sahab, Bilkis Banu, and Sunil Chera, and his wife, actually. Seema. And the strange thing even there is how she was Farzana, who marries Sunil from the slum across and becomes Seema. And how Seema also becomes the word of the border between these two slums, where one side eventually decimates the other side, right? Crosses this border. And so much of Ahmedabad's geography is about that now, like, oh, don't go to that area, that's across the border. And this idea that you're essentially going to mini Pakistan if you go to a certain part of the city. So it was very interesting to really think about who are these people who are going to be in the book. And for me, especially Ehsan Jaffrey became this name that had to be in my book for me to first sort of, lower my own head to this martyr, to understand that this was a person who gave himself up, not just for his neighborhood, for this idea of India and the thing that he had lived his whole life for. And I had never known him in person, and yet he's this myth. He's this, sort of.
Can you give some context to everyone who hasn't read the book or about Ehsan Jaffrey?
I think Ehsan Jaffrey's story is known enough, but He was a member of parliament from Gujarat, an ex-member of parliament at the time of 2002. And on the morning when all of the violence began, these mobs first surrounded his neighborhood. And everybody in this gated community rushed to his apartment, thinking because he had been in public service, that's where they would be safest. And until that moment, whenever we had had this sort of violence in Ahmedabad, it had pretty much been divided along class and caste lines. And so you did not end up seeing officers and folks who were in the educated sort of milieu being risked as much. And this time, it was as if the state and the mobs were trying to tell us by making an example of a person that this is now for all of you. And so Ehsan Jafri on the day called everybody in his phone book. There are stories that also say that he called even Modi saying, please save me, please send the police. The police had come, told him that you'll be safe, don't worry. And yet a few hours after these mobs had been attacking the boundary walls, they broke in, they slaughtered everybody, burned alive, more than 60 people in this neighborhood. And Ehsan Jafri himself sort of came out to plead with them, saying, take me, but leave everybody else. And he was the first person that they basically massacred very brutally. But the case that his wife fought for 20 years, Zakia Jafri, is a landmark case, which even though they lost eventually in the Indian Supreme Court, it was insane to see this one woman, this widow, go up there and not just say, my husband died like this or my neighbor died like that, but take all of this proof and witness testimony and lay it directly at the doorstep of the chief minister and now India's prime minister. And that was an act of courage that I have not seen in my lifetime.
There's, I think these testimonies and stories I mean, up until this case and up until this memoir, I don't know if we've read comprehensive experiences from people who are describing what happened to them in 2002. And that's why, I mean, this is a really brave thing to do and an amazing sort of record of what went on. And I'm wondering now what, you know, as you see it out in the world, and now it's reached India, and you're slowly going to get responses, reviews, perhaps feedback on social media or whenever you go back to India. We've talked about this a little bit privately. I remember you said to me that it means something for the next generation and for your own family that something like this exists and it's out there. Right. And so what is the India of today and the India that just had elections, and BJP is back, but with less of a majority than it had before, but they're still sort of, it's been a decade or so of like their power. What, I guess, impact, if any, do you hope stories like this would have in India today?
So I'm not by any means the first person that has put these stories together. There's been incredible amounts of reportage and writing and testimony, and people like Jafri Saab's daughter went across this country even telling these exact same stories at universities and in rooms like these. And yet here we are. And yet when I look at so much other world history playing out in this way as well, where the ability to erase just works with so much more gusto than the work that we do to remember. That's the attempt with this book. The fact that perhaps in every generation, there will need to be a Nasreen, a Zara, who will come back and keep writing this back into history, because there will always be those who would benefit hugely from folks remembering. I teach in the US and I teach Hindi to a lot of heritage students who are from families of Indian origin, who are mostly born after 2002 at this point. And most of them have never heard of this. They've heard of all of this other sort of mythical Indian history. And then a lot of what actually happened in their parents' lifetime has just not reached them. There was one student who, after we spoke about this, comes to me and says, you know, my parents had gone away for their honeymoon when this happened. They were Gujarati Hindus in Ahmedabad. And their parents called them and said, stay out there wherever you want, don't come back because there's violence happening. And so I asked, I was like, oh my God, so how long did they have to stay? And when did they come? And he just said, no, they lived on that side of the river, so they came back after 2 weeks. And so it's this sort of dissonance that books like these are meant to break into and create conversation.
Well, thank you so much. This is such amazing insights coming from you, and thank you to everyone AAWW for having us talk about this. We do want to get questions from the audience, so if anyone has questions for Zara, please.
I'll take the mic. I'll take that.
Unmute.
No problem. Any questions? Brilliant writer. There it is.
Sarah, as you know, I really loved your book. Can you talk a little bit about the poetry? I have several questions I want to ask you, because I think that was your love for poetry and the way you use it to bridge all these different divides was so wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about how you came by that?
Thank you so much. And yes, I love to talk about that, and I can go on and on. Poetry, funnily, has always, as I said, been the most generative way for me to think and to feel rooted in my world, especially Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi poetry. But now as my sort of linguistic abilities have grown in the last few years, living in different parts, just, Tamil poetry, Telugu poetry, Kannada poetry, just the idea that we have been thinking these ideas for centuries. This is not new to us. This sort of radical, free ability to see ourselves as an equal society, this imagination is not new. And it's that sort of re-education that poetry did for me in going back and looking at, say, Baba Ganj Shakkar's work, or thinking about Wali Gujarati's poetry. And some of it sometimes really, poetry works for me the way, I guess, like a Bible or Quran works for people, where they open it and then just the perfect page shows up when you need it. And I've felt like that, especially with Wali's work, which is insane because he was also a person like my grandfather who came out of the Deccan and, a migrant to this place and settled here and called it home and put roots down and made poetry and literature in this place and became a saint of this place, and was eventually pulled out of this land during the pogrom, and his shrine was decimated and, a road laid over it. And so that sort of erasure is also something that writing back that poetry into our literature and reminding people that this is actually where we come from and these are the stories that feed us, becomes a political, a literary choice, a very highly emotional choice. But also, when I think of what is my highest emotional state to write in, it's song and lyric, and the way that, Hindi cinema music has fed so many of us. And for those who come from different cinema traditions in India, like that music is such a part of who we are. Our poetry never lacks rhythm. It has cadence and it
You
has
can always sing it.
Yes, and I mean, when I see folks writing ghazals in the West, I'm like, well, but how are you going to sing this?
Yeah, they can't sing.
Where is that tonality to it? So that sort of musicality became a huge part of how my sentences and my sort of essays would, my chapters would begin and end. Any other questions?
Hi, it was a very nice talk. I had a question about your family. Like, your memoir is obviously your story, but I'm assuming, I haven't read the book, but I'm assuming it's also, in many ways, it's a story of your family as well. Your mother, your father, and your siblings. I was wondering what were their reactions when they read your book, if they have. And also, like, how do you as a writer contextualize the stories of those immediately around you when you're writing from your own voice, but at the same time you also want to be true to how they see the story being played as well, because it may not be the same.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. For me, writing a memoir, actually the hardest part was centering myself. I don't think we come from a cultural tradition where the I is big. The we is usually bigger. And to write in this American tradition where the I has to be inserted into the page first, and then from there see the world by itself was a huge challenge in many ways. In fact, my first few drafts were really just about everything that was happening around, and very rarely really centered me. And then my editor and everybody else sort of had to like massage me into the story in some ways. But I mean, you have two questions there, so I'll try and talk about how my family reacted to it. There's very little left of my family today. There's only my mother and my sister. And we have functioned for these last 20 years as this sort of little island of stories where we tell each other our stories, and then we kind of interrogate each other's stories, and we've sort of helped each other build what we think is happening to us or has happened to us. And that's been its own very beautiful sort of healing space. And if I had to ever have an ashram, I think my ashram would be my mother and my sister in some way. But working through this book, I very much constantly went back to them to verify and to say, well, this is how I remember it, but I'd like to make sure this is how you remember it. And even in doing that, it was important to sometimes help them detach from their ideas of daughter, sister, wife, and say, well, as a person in that moment, what were you thinking? What was your aspiration? So that sort of detaching role from person was a huge part of the exercise. And for those who were not around, my dada, my dadi, my father, my pupu, that actually became a gift for me to start seeing them as full people that had lived these rich lives, these layered lives, and lives much before I came on the scene. So kind of going back and looking at that helped me see, by the time I came, this person was already fully cooked into this version of them. And that's the gift they were able to give me. And so I have to contend with that, but I have to keep in mind context. So that became sort of how I dealt with that part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My question is, I'm slightly reluctant to ask it because it's so easy to cast a writer as somebody who might be a spokesperson for this or that, and I'm reluctant for anybody to be forced into that position. But you said something about Jaffrey that so struck me about how he represented what India could be, had been, was. And I wonder to what extent you feel that has also been erased over the last 10 years, and that what work needs to be done to collectively find that version of India, or the version of India that India has always told itself it was and continues to, but obviously through a very different lens now.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the care in that question, because through this journey of writing this and then putting it out and sort of being the face that has to go with the book, that has been my main concern, to not speak for people in a way that is just not representative of them. And it's such an incredible variety of views, right? That's what you get for being 1.5 billion people. We all have very strong opinions of what India means. But Ehsan Saab, particularly from what I understood of his story, really stood for this sort of version of and vision of India coming out of independence, those first few decades, where there was certainly a willingness to contend with what didn't work, and a willingness to look at it and say, this is the mess we have been left with in the aftermath of 250 years of colonization, but we're willing to do the work, and it will take time. And that idea of sabr, of patience, that this is the long haul and we're going to make it. I think what happened for my generation was 1992, our liberalization that sort of just put us on this highway to your McDonald's and your malls and, MTV on our televisions. And we just kind of exploded in these ways that we weren't even prepared or ready to fully contend with. And within that, now we have a generation where with the internet coming in and with social media and with a whole troll army that the right wing has prepared. And, you have mechanisms in place to push us into yet another century in yet another direction when we've barely caught our breath with the sort of violence that the 90s and the early 2000s saw. And so it really comes down to each of us at this point to find those touch points of what was our true ancestry. And this, I don't mean in terms of what is my caste lineage and what did my great grandfather do when everybody's grandfather was a freedom fighter in India, It's about really asking yourself, who are the people that made this project of India? Because India is a project of imagination, of just wild, audacious imagination. To think that all of us with as many different cultures and opinions can coexist in this way is constantly a tense conversation, right? And it's not just about Muslims. Today we're seeing what's happening in Manipur. There's what happens in Kashmir. There's the way that our islands are being annexed into these corporate holes. So to understand that people came together to unify as a nation against this colonial power was by understanding common purpose. And that sense of common purpose has been lost. And somehow the right wing have framed that common purpose in the idea of a Hindu nation. And we need to offer a better common purpose. And I think when we can do that, then we'd be able to challenge this.
Sorry. Hi, I just want to say that this is absolutely incredible. I think you're such a powerful and beautiful speaker. Like, seriously, I have so many chills and thank you so much for writing this. So I do have a quick question, is that something that really struck me to my core was when you talked about how India, or specifically Gujarat, I believe, really is inspired by how America, in terms of imperialism or legitimizing state violence. And I thought it was so interesting that it goes beyond, pop culture and fashion, but in terms of, post 9/11 and how it has struck inspiration and how India should also do that on itself. And so I'm kind of wondering, now that you're living in the belly of the beast in America, how has that really informed your writing and also your understanding now being away from India and, being away from your home? Yeah, I think that's something that's really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah. That is such a important question because it's a thing I've been sitting with in especially this last year of really seeing America. I feel like America has opened its chest, to me, and I've finally been able to gaze into what feels like a very rotten, decaying inside. Sorry for that imagery. It's what I think it has something to do with what's happening on our phones right now and what we're seeing on a daily basis too. But the thing it has given me is this appreciation for what it means to belong to a land and to know that in your bones, that you did come from a place where you knew a land's impulses. You knew a people's aspirations, you understood the sense of common purpose. And then to come to a place where essentially there is a nation built upon a people that existed, right? And a way of life that already existed. And it terrifies me to realize that that's what India looks at and sees that as progress. And that's the aspiration for us now, to have these sort of mega projects and to have these drilling zones all over the place and to, increase our energy consumption, that's the direction in which we think growth will happen for us. Because what is rich and beautiful about it is the fact that we weren't one nation before the British came. And something about that sort of power oppressing us taught us what it means to save ourselves from not just colonialism, but this extraction, this constant sense of extraction. And that is a spirit that I hope people in India and Pakistan and all of these spaces can hold on to. But I truly also wish Americans would see that in what is happening. And there's so many wonderful groups that do that and are doing that good work. But for me as an outsider, even now, I think that's the part that sits very uneasily. And I don't know how to wrestle with it fully.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sarah. One thing that's very special about your book is that you have all these moments where you kind of describe people around you revealing themselves for who they are. And you read about this teacher who helped your family, and maybe you could talk about that. But I just wondered if any of these people who populate the book are people you were in touch with again today, including some of the people who revealed themselves to not care about your family. Like, did you come across anyone? Do you know kind of what happened to others who were around you at that time?
Yeah, I can tell you a little story actually about this. So when I was in Leeds, I was only 21 at the time in England studying, and not far off away from 2002 to have fully processed or known how to deal with things. And there was a kid in my class growing up who had a Muslim sounding name because that was so cool to have Muslim sounding names for Gujarati kids. And she was the kind of kid who would, mock us because in the winter, when they would all wear fun stockings, we would wear shalwars under our uniform because that's all our parents could afford. And she'd kind of point at us and mark us in some ways. And there's just a lot of this sort of slow violence, microaggression, right? In schools that we had grown up with. And so to me, this was very much the picture of a bully. And Facebook had just started at the time when I was in England, and this person finds me on Facebook and is like, I hate this social media thing. There's all the people who I just left without giving my phone number to now suddenly know how to find me. And so she was like, oh, if you ever come to London, I'm at London School of Economics and, and I go to say hi because I'm still this person who's just awkward and I'm not sure how to have a conversation. And we go to McDonald's. I don't know why this McDonald's is always haunting me in Gujarat. And we go to a McDonald's basement on Oxford Street somewhere. And I don't eat a thing. And I'm just sitting there shaking through this whole exchange. And she's chattering away about how well she did later in her boards and where she went and what she did and blah, blah, blah. And then I came back. I very awkwardly said bye, came back. And then I just Facebook messaged her and apologized to her for how badly behaved I was. And she in turn tells me, it's okay. I didn't like what happened, and I have done a lot of work in the community afterwards to help. And so it was this weird, looking in a mirror suddenly and understanding that this is how people have reframed reality for themselves in Ahmedabad because they've had to live with it. And I've been lucky enough to leave in some ways. But cut to a few years ago or something, I see her again somewhere in social media. And now she's like a gallerist in, Bombay and doing work on caste and so it's this. What's the name of the gallery? I think I've said enough. It's just it's the sort of stuff that confounds me because it's so telling of how much of a straight ladder there is for some people to success, even out of pogroms, and how the rest of us are crawling on our knees to get to a place. But yes, there's also others in the book, like Miss Preeti, who was our history teacher. And it was such a small town that, if she was teaching me history, my aunt was teaching her daughter in college. And so we all knew each other in these ways. And she had actually put the Diary of Anne Frank in my hand the year before the program happened. And because she saw how much I just love to write in these sort of, more lyrical ways. And I spoke and she's like, you have to read this. And I think everything we're studying about the Holocaust would just feel so much more personal. And she's, of course, in the book as one of the people that sends us food when we run out of everything, because her husband is a cop and she can send that into our neighborhood. I found her on Facebook. And if there was a way to cry in comments, I think we would both be just tearfully, sort of mourning the years that we didn't have with each other, because she raised me with the consciousness that I have today. So.
Question.
Yes.
Can you just please speak to the role of translating history and politics for people from one place to another? Do you spend any time worrying about it, or do you just write towards people who will understand immediately? Something that I've always wanted. Curious about your process there.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, especially in writing this book, I started to recognize, once I understood it was for an American market, what that phrase meant. It was very eye-opening about the place that the American education system is in. Because there was just, the amount of explanation and exposition that had to be done sometimes felt so crude and sort of staccato in ways that would just not let the story flow, and yet it had to be there. But I fought that impulse a lot, including the fact that there's so much dialogue in the book that is Urdu or Hindi or Gujarati, and there's spots where I translated for you and others where I'm just so, that was a choice to say, meet me halfway.
That's what I really enjoyed about the book is you have language running through it so seamlessly. You have so many different languages that in a way, I felt like the book would have been incomplete without having so many languages in there, because that's just a part of the fabric of your life. It's a part of the fabric of India. It's
Right.
part of all these experiences that you can't show. There's no way to translate all that without having just the words themselves there.
Right.
So,
And also, language in India is political. Whom in your household you speak to in English?
yes.
Whom will you say aap to? Who will you say tu to? And those registers of formality, right? They say something about politics within the household.
Yeah.
So, and that is all lost in a you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Thank you all so much for being here. For having us, and you are going to be signing books tonight, so please get a copy and get a signing done.
Just big shout out to Nur and to everybody here, because this was, yes, thank you. This was the first event on my tour that was booked, and everything else fell together around it. So thank you for everything. But